In the deepest hours of night, when even the Eldar keep silent watch, strange whispers began to drift from the ruins of Dol Guldur, the ancient fortress, once the stronghold of the necromancer ere his identity was revealed as the Dark Lord returned, had lain empty these many years since the War of the Ring. Yet now, beneath its crumbling stones and twisted iron, something stirred. Thranduil, king of the woodland realm, stood upon the highest platform of his hall, his keen eyes turned southward toward the dark hill. The whispers came not as sound to mortal ears, but as a trembling in the very fabric of Arda itself, a discord that set his ancient heart to unease. "My lord," came the voice of Galion, his chief counselor, ascending the winding stairs with haste unusual for an elf. "The patrol from the southern borders brings troubling word. The beasts of Mirkwood flee northward, and the very trees speak of a presence awakening where none should dwell." The elven king's fair face grew stern beneath his crown of autumn leaves. After so long a peace, what evil would dare to claim that accursed place? "Summon Legolas from Ithilien, and send word to Lord Elrond in Rivendell. If shadow rises again in our time, we must not face it as our forebears did, divided and unaware." Yet even as he spoke these words, Thranduil felt a chill that had naught to do with the autumn air. For in the whispers that came from Dol Guldur, he heard something that filled him with a dread deeper than any he had known since the days when Sauron himself walked in shadow through the depths of his realm. Far to the south, in the Tower Hills beyond the Shire, an old wizard paused in his walking. Gandalf the White lifted his head, his keen senses catching what others could not perceive. The wind that came from the east carried with it an echo of malice, faint but unmistakable. His weathered hand tightened upon his staff, and his grey eyes grew troubled. "Curious," he murmured to himself, though no living thing save the grass beneath his feet might hear. "The Dark Lord is destroyed, his ring unmade, yet still the shadow reaches out its hand. What manner of evil could survive such absolute defeat?" 3 weeks had passed since the first whispers, and now all the Free Peoples felt the growing unease. In Minas Tirith, King Elisar held council with his wisest advisers, while ravens flew daily between Edoras, the lonely mountain, and Dale. The very air seemed to thicken with portent, as though Middle-earth itself held its breath. Legolas arrived at his father's halls on a moonless night, his fair face grave with concern. "The trees of Ithilien speak of a wrongness in the world," he told the assembled council of elves. "Not the corruption of the Dark Lord's mate, but something older, more primal." Master Elrond had come from Rivendell with a small company of his kindred, their white horses swift as the wind. In the great hall beneath the starlight, he stood before the gathered elves with scrolls and tomes ancient beyond the memory of men. "I have searched the records of Gil-galad, and even the fragments that remain from Lindon of the elder days," spoke the Lord of Rivendell, his voice heavy with the weight of ages. "There are references, brief and cryptic, to something called the Ost-in-Edhil, the fortress of the elves. Not Ost-in-Edhil, that was the realm of Celebrimbor in Eregion, but an older place, built in secret during the years of the trees." Thranduil leaned forward in his throne of carved wood. "What manner of fortress, and what bearing might it have upon our present troubles?" "According to these ancient texts," Elrond continued, unrolling a scroll written in the flowing script of the Noldor, "it was built as a prison, not for the servants of darkness, but for one of the Maiar themselves, one who had fallen to shadow, ere even Melkor was bound in Valinor." A silence fell upon the hall, broken only by the whisper of wind through the great trees that formed the living pillars of the chamber. At last, Legolas spoke the question that burned in every heart present. "What has become of this Maia? Surely, if such a being were imprisoned by the craft of the Eldar, it could not break free without great upheaval." Elrond's eyes were dark with foreboding. "That is what troubles me most, son of Thranduil, for these texts speak of binding that could only be broken by the willing sacrifice of one of the firstborn, and of a key that was hidden where shadow could never reach it." "Dol Guldur," breathed Thranduil, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise in his mind. The whispers we hear are not the calling of some new evil, but the response to something that has been taken from its hiding. In the Blue Mountains, where few now dwelt, save the ancient among the Eldar, Círdan the shipwright stood upon the grey haven's highest tower. His eyes, older than the sunrise over Middle-earth, gazed not westward to the undying lands, as was his wont, but eastward toward the growing darkness. A ship had arrived in the night, not one of the white vessels that bore the elves to Valinor, but a small craft of Númenórean make, its sails grey as storm clouds. From it stepped a figure cloaked and hooded, moving with the measured pace of great weariness. "Hail and well met, Lord Círdan," spoke the newcomer, casting back his hood to reveal features both noble and careworn. It was Elladan, son of Elrond, but his face bore lines of grief that had not been there when last the shipwright had seen him. "Grim news you bring, I deem, young lord," said Círdan, though Elladan had seen more years than many races knew in their entirety. "Your journey was swift, yet fraught with purpose dark." Elladan nodded, drawing from his cloak a bundle wrapped in mithril cloth. "My father sent me with all haste, for this was discovered in the deepest vaults of Rivendell, hidden where even the ring-bearer's presence could not detect it." He unwrapped the bundle, revealing a crystal of impossible beauty, dark as the space between stars, yet shot through with veins of silver fire. "The Ithil stone," breathed Círdan, "the moon crystal of Gil-galad, lost these many ages past. But how?" "Not lost," Elladan corrected grimly. "Hidden by design, for my father now recalls the words spoken to him by Gil-galad ere the last alliance marched to Mordor. Should the greatest darkness be overcome, the High King said, beware lest in our joy we forget the lesser shadows that preceded it." Círdan took the crystal in his ancient hands, and immediately his face grew pale. "This is the key spoken of in your father's texts, but see how its light flickers and dims? Someone has touched it with purpose, and, recently, the bindings weaken, even as we speak. Then we are too late to prevent what comes," said Elladan. "Perhaps not too late to stand against it." "Perhaps," agreed Círdan, though his voice held little hope. "Yet first, we must understand what manner of evil we face. Send word to your father. The Ithil stone must be brought to Dol Guldur itself. Only there can we hope to learn the truth of what stirs in the shadow." 7 days after Elladan's arrival at the Grey Haven, a company gathered at the borders of Mirkwood, such as had not been seen since the days of the last alliance. Gandalf the White had come from the Shire, his staff gleaming with inner light. Beside him rode Gimli the dwarf, now lord of the glittering caves, his axe keen and his beard braided with mithril threads. From Ithilien came Legolas, with a dozen of his finest archers, their bows strung with hair from the manes of the Mearas. King Thranduil himself had donned his armor of war, silver mail that rang like music when he moved, and his great sword, Eglos, sang softly in its sheath. But strangest of all was the figure who awaited them at the Elf King's halls, a dwarf woman of great age and dignity, her hair white as mountain snow, and her eyes keen as winter stars. She bore upon her breast the sigil of Erebor, but also symbols older than the Lonely Mountain itself. "This is Nain's daughter, Duath," Thranduil announced to the gathering. "She is keeper of the old lore among the Khazad, and she brings knowledge that may aid us in the trials ahead." 2. Duath stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of stone and deep places. "My lords, in the deeps of Khazad-dûm, ere the Balrog was awakened, there were chambers sealed with spells of the Valar themselves. In one such chamber, my people found writings in the tongue of the Mire, warnings of the bound one called Ungwethrin, the Shadow Heart." "Ungwethrin," repeated Gandalf, and his face grew troubled. "That name is known to me, though I had hoped never to hear it spoken again. He was among the Mire who served Aule in the making of Middle-earth, but his heart turned to domination ere the Eldar awoke. It was he who first taught Melkor the arts of binding and corruption." "Then he is indeed dangerous beyond measure," said Elrond, "for if Ungwethrin is freed, he will seek to claim what his former pupil could not." the utter dominion of all living things. Legolas looked toward Dol Guldur, its dark mass visible even from the woodland realm. How long do we have before the bindings fail completely? Círdan held forth the Ithil stone, its light now flickering like a candle in a gale. Hours, perhaps, no more than a day. We must ride now, or all our discussion will be for naught. And so the company set forth from the woodland realm as the sun reached its zenith, their path leading ever southward toward the hill of dark sorcery, where an evil older than Sauron himself stirred toward wakefulness. Through the brown lands they rode, where once the gardens of the Entwives had bloomed in ages past. The very earth seemed to recoil from their passage, and no bird sang in the twisted trees that dotted the barren landscape. Above them, clouds gathered, though no natural wind drove them, and the light of day grew dim and sickly. "The Valor help us," muttered Gimli, his keen dwarf eyes scanning the desolation around them. Even in the darkest days of the war, this land was not so cursed. What manner of evil could poison the very ground with its stirring? Gandalf rode beside him, his white robes seeming to gather what little light remained. Ungvethrin was ever a corrupter of the natural order. Where Sauron sought to dominate through fear and force, the Shadow Heart delights in the perversion of all things fair and growing. If he breaks free completely, this wasteland will spread until all Middle-earth lies barren beneath his touch. They made camp as the first stars appeared, though the light of Gillistel seemed dimmed by the presence that pressed upon them from the south. Legolas set his elven sentries in a wide circle, their keen senses alert for any sign of movement in the darkness. But it was Duath who first detected the approaching danger. The dwarf woman rose from her place by the small fire, her hand upon the ancient war hammer at her side. "Something comes," she said quietly. "Not orcs or wolves, but things that crawl and whisper in tongues forgotten before the making of the world." They came with the deep darkness, shapes that were neither beast nor spirit, but something between. Their eyes glowed with sickly green fire, and where their feet touched the ground, the earth itself began to smoke and char. Behind them stalked larger forms, walking upright but wrong in every line and angle, as though they were the shadows of men cast by a twisted light. "Oruthil," breathed Elrond, drawing his blade, Hadafang. "Shadow spawn of the first corruption. I had thought them all destroyed in the ruin of Thangorodrim." The battle was fierce, but brief. The light of Gandalf's staff blazed like a star, driving back the shadow creatures with its radiance. Legolas and his archers sent arrow after arrow into the darkness, each shaft glowing with elven magic. Gimli's axe sang as it clove through forms that dissolved into mist at his touch, while Thranduil's sword traced patterns of light that no creature of darkness could cross. But when the last of the Oruthil had been banished back to whatever realm had spawned them, the company found that their foes had not come merely to destroy. In the center of their camp, where the Ithil stone had lain safely warded, there was now only empty ground and the lingering scent of corruption. "They have taken the key," said Círdan grimly. "Ungvethrin reaches out even from his prison, and his servants obey his will." "Then we ride to our doom," said Duath matter-of-factly, "for without the moon crystal, we have no hope of binding him again, should he break free." Gandalf looked toward Dol Guldur, now visible as a black spike against the starlit sky. "Perhaps, but we swore an oath to guard Middle-earth against all evil. We shall not fail in that duty, though the odds be hopeless, and the enemy beyond our strength." Dawn brought no comfort, for the sun rose pale and watery, its light seeming to falter as it touched the boundaries of Dol Guldur. The ancient fortress loomed before them now, its towers twisted and blackened by centuries of dark sorcery. Yet there was something different about it, a sense of eager anticipation, as though the very stones awaited some great and terrible culmination. "The whisper have grown to scream," said Legolas, his sensitive ears catching sounds that others could not perceive. "Whatever process began weeks ago now nears its completion." They left their horses at the foot of the hill, for no beast would venture closer to that place of shadow. The path that wound upward was cracked and broken, and from the fissures in the stone came a foul vapor that stung the eyes and burned the throat. Halfway to the summit, they encountered the first guardian, a creature that had once been a great spider, but was now something far worse. The corruption of Ungwethrin had transformed it into a thing of living shadow, its many eyes blazing with the same sickly green fire they had seen in the Oruthil. "Ancestor of Shelob," growled Gimli, hefting his axe, "but fouler than even that devil." The battle was harder than any they had fought, for the spider thing seemed to draw strength from the very air around Dol Guldur. Its web was not merely sticky silk, but strands of pure darkness that drained the life from whatever they touched. Only the combined might of all their company, and the blazing light of Gandalf's staff, finally drove the creature back into whatever pit had spawned it. But the delay had cost them precious time. As they climbed the final approach to the fortress gates, a sound rang out across the desolate land, a cry of triumph and malice that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. "We are too late," said Elrond, his fair face grim with defeat. "The bindings are broken. Ungwethrin is free." The gates of Dol Guldur stood open before them, and from within came a light that was not light, but rather the absence of all illumination. It hurt to look upon, yet drew the eye with irresistible fascination. And in that terrible radiance, a figure began to take shape, tall as a tower, beautiful as the morning star, and corrupt beyond all measure of redemption. "Welcome, little lights," spoke Ungwethrin, and his voice was like honey poured over poison. "How long I have waited for this moment! How long I have dreamed of the day when I would taste freedom once more, and set about the work that was interrupted so long ago." The Shadow Heart stepped forth from his prison, and where his feet touched the ground, all living things withered and died. His form was that of one of the fair mire, but shot through with veins of darkness that pulsed like a corrupted heart. In his hand he bore a staff of black crystal, and upon his brow sat a crown of shadow that seemed to drink in all light. "You have served your purpose well," he continued, gesturing toward the company. "Without your arrival, without your precious moon crystal, I could never have broken the final seal. My servants brought it to me, and its power completed the ritual of unbinding. I am in your debt." Oh, the terrible truth of their unwitting betrayal struck the company like a physical blow. They had been manipulated from the very beginning, their every action serving to free the very evil they sought to prevent. Ungwethrin smiled at their horror, and in that smile was all the malice of eons. "Did you truly believe," he said, his voice carrying across the ruins like poisoned wind, "that the whispers you heard were mere accident? I have been calling to you since first I sensed the weakness in my bonds. Every step you took, every decision you made, served my purpose." Gandalf stepped forward, his staff blazing with white fire. "You may have gained your freedom through our folly, but you will find Middle-earth is not defenseless. The free peoples will stand against you as they stood against your former pupil." Ungwethrin laughed, and the sound was like the breaking of mountains. "Pupil, dear Mithrandir, you understand so little. I was never Sauron's teacher. He was mine to command, my greatest creation, shaped and molded by my will into the instrument of my design." The revelation struck them like thunder. Sauron, the Dark Lord who had terrorized Middle-earth for ages, had been nothing more than a servant of this greater evil. "The One Ring," continued Ungwethrin, "was forged according to plans I whispered to him in dream. The corruption of the Nazgul, the binding of the dragons, the very concept of dominion through fear, all my gifts to a useful tool. And when that tool was destroyed, I simply waited for the next opportunity to present itself." Elrond's face had gone pale as starlight. "Then the War of the Ring, all our suffering and sacrifice, was merely the prelude to my true work," finished the Shadow Heart. "Sauron sought to rule Middle-earth. I shall remake it entirely, transforming every living thing into an extension of my will. No more shall there be the chaos of individual thought and desire, All shall be one, and one shall be all, under my absolute dominion. Thranduil drew his blade, the ancient steel singing as it left the sheath. Then we shall stop you here, as our forebears stopped Melkor at the gates of Angband. You may try, said Ungvethrin with amusement, but consider, I am no mere Vala to be bound by the music of creation. I am Maya, spirit of Aule himself, and I have had ages to perfect my arts. Behold the first fruits of my labor. The Shadow Heart raised his staff, and the very air around them began to change. The remaining stones of Dol Guldur flowed like water, reshaping themselves into new and terrible forms. The dead earth beneath their feet sprouted with plants that were not plants, twisted growths of flesh and bone that reached toward them with hungry tendrils. But worst of all was what happened to the shadows. Every shade cast by stone or tree began to move independently, taking on lives of their own. They detached from their sources and shambled forward, an army of darkness that multiplied with every passing moment. "Fight them, if you will," called Ungvethrin as he began to ascend into the poisoned air, his form growing ever more terrible and magnificent. "But know that each shadow you destroy will spawn 2 more. Soon all Middle-earth shall be nothing but shadow, and I its only light." In the chaos of battle against the multiplying shadows, it was Duath who made the crucial discovery. While her companions fought desperately against foes that seemed to reproduce with every sword stroke, the dwarf woman had retreated to the broken stones of Dol Guldur's foundation, seeking in dwarf craft some weakness in Ungvethrin's newfound power. "Look here!" she called over the din of battle, her voice carrying the authority of mountain kings. "The corruption spreads from a single point, there, where the ancient foundations meet the new growths. If we could strike at the source." Círdan, his blade glowing with the light of Gil-Estel, as he carved through advancing shadows, shook his head grimly. "The source is Ungvethrin himself. We cannot reach him while he commands the very air above us." But Legolas, his keen archer's eyes scanning the ruined fortress, saw what the others had missed. "Not Ungvethrin," he said, loosing arrow after arrow into the shadow host. "The Ithel stone, see how it pulses at the base of the central tower? He still draws power from it. Indeed, the moon crystal lay half buried in the twisted ground where the Shadow Heart had first emerged, its silver fire now corrupted to sickly green. With each pulse of its tainted light, the shadows grew stronger and more numerous. "The stone must be destroyed," said Gandalf, his staff creating a barrier of white flame around the company. "But any weapon that touches it will be corrupted in turn." We need the flame imperishable," interrupted Elrond suddenly. "The fire that burns in the secret fire, untainted by any corruption. Gandalf, you bear that flame within you as one of the Maiar. Could you not, at the cost of my life perhaps?" The wizard replied. "To release that fire would burn away all that I am in this form. But if it would stop this evil..." Thranduil caught his arm. "Wait, there may be another way." The Elf King turned to Duath, his eyes bright with sudden hope. "You spoke of writings in Khazad-dûm, warnings about Ungvethrin. Were there not also instructions? The dwarves are master craftsmen. Surely they would have recorded not just the danger, but the means to combat it." Duath's eyes widened with understanding. "The Song of Unmaking. How could I have forgotten?" Saredurtsain. She began to chant in the ancient tongue of the Khazad, words that rang like hammer blows on anvil. "Baruch Khazad, Khazad Aimenu, Sigin Taragna Khazad, Aimenu, Ungol Gabil Biriz, Khazad Dumu Khele." The effect was immediate and startling. The corrupted Ithil stone began to pulse erratically, its green fire flickering toward silver once more. The advancing shadows slowed, their forms becoming less solid. "The old binding words!" cried Círdan with joy. "The dwarves remember what we had forgotten." But Ungvethrin had heard the chant as well, and his rage shook the very sky. "Impossible! Those words were lost when Khazad-dûm fell. The Balrog was sent specifically to ensure..." He stopped, realization dawning on his perfect, terrible features. "You, the corruption of Durin's bane, was my work. designed to destroy the last traces of the binding lore. But if you still remember. Durit, the Shadow Heart's fury manifested as a storm of darkness that swept down from the poisoned sky, seeking to destroy Duath before she could complete her chant. But the company rallied around her, their weapons forming a barrier of light and steel. "Continue!" shouted Gandalf, his staff blazing like a star. "We will hold them back!" The battle raged with supernatural fury, as Duath's voice rose above the din, each word of the ancient dwarf song striking Ungwethrin like a physical blow. The Shadowheart's perfect form began to waver and blur, as though the very fabric of his being was being unraveled by the binding word. "Impossible!" he screamed, his voice now holding notes of panic. "I am beyond such primitive magic. I am Maya, spirit of the forge fires, master of—" "You are bound!" Duath's voice rang out with the authority of mountain depths. "As you were bound before, so shall you be bound again." The words of Aula himself, spoken through his children. "Compel your obedience." The corrupted Ithil stone pulsed one final time, its green fire flaring to brilliant silver before cracking down the middle. From the fissure poured forth a light so pure and clean that the shadow spawn shrieked and dissolved at its touch. But this was not the end Ungwethrin had planned. As his form began to fade, pulled inexorably back toward the prison that had held him for so long, his face twisted with a malice beyond measure. "If I cannot have dominion," he snarled, "then let there be nothing. Better an empty world than one that defies my will." The Shadowheart raised his staff for one final devastating blow, not against the company, but against the very foundations of reality in this place. The air began to crack like glass, and through the fissures came a void so absolute that it hurt to contemplate. "He seeks to unmake this part of creation itself," cried Elrond in horror. "If he succeeds, the destruction will spread until all Middle-earth is swallowed by nothingness." Gandalf stepped forward, his face set with grim resolve. "Then I must do what I hoped to avoid." The wizard raised his staff, and the light within it began to change from white to gold, then to a brilliant beyond all color. "Farewell, my friends. Tell Frodo and the others that their sacrifice was not in vain." But before Gandalf could release the flame imperishable that would destroy both him and Ungwethrin, another voice spoke from the heart of the light. "Peace, Mithrandir. This is not your burden to bear." From the broken Ithil stone stepped a figure of such beauty and majesty that even Ungwethrin's malice stilled. It was Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor, but not as he had been in life. This was his spirit, preserved within the moon crystal for just such a moment as this. "You!" gasped Ungwethrin. "But you perished!" "I felt your passing on the slopes of Mount Doom. I gave my life to ensure Sauron's defeat," replied Gil-galad calmly. "But before I died, I bound my spirit to this crystal, knowing that one day a greater evil might arise. You taught your servant well, Ungwethrin, but you forgot to teach him caution. Through Sauron's defeat, I learned the true source of the shadow, and I have waited here to face it." The Elf Lord raised his hand, and in it blazed Eglos, his great spear, now wrought of pure starlight. "By the power of Arendil, by the light of the Silmarils, by the music of the Ainur itself, I bind you, Ungwethrin the Corrupted, to the void that you would invoke." The spear of Gil-galad pierced not Ungwethrin's form, but the very essence of his being. Where the starlight touched the Shadowheart's darkness, reality itself seemed to sing, not with discord and corruption, but with the original music that had shaped the world. "No!" screamed Ungwethrin, his perfect features finally showing the true madness that lay beneath. "I will not be bound again. I will not return to that endless darkness. I am Maya. I am power incarnate. I am—" "You are nothing," said Gil-galad with infinite sadness. "You chose darkness when you could have chosen light, corruption when you could have chosen creation. You became nothing the moment you first turned from the will of Ilúvatar." The Shadowheart's form began to unravel, not slowly as before, but with the swiftness of shadows fleeing before the dawn. The void he had tried to invoke turned upon its summoner, drawing him inexorably toward its empty heart. But even as he faced ultimate destruction, Ungwethren's malice found one last target. "If I fall," he snarled, "I do not fall alone." The dwarf woman's life force is linked to the binding words. As they fade, so does she. Indeed, Duath had collapsed to her knees, her face pale as mountain snow. The effort of speaking the ancient words had drained her very essence, and now she faded even as her enemy was destroyed. "Hold on, daughter of the mountain," cried Gimli, kneeling beside his kinswoman. "Your deed this day will be remembered as long as stone endures." But Duath smiled, her eyes bright despite her failing strength. "I do not fade, son of Glóin. I return to the halls of my fathers, to the Maker who shaped the Khazad from stone and flame. Tell my people, tell them the old words still have power." Gil-galad turned from the final destruction of Ungwethren to kneel beside the failing dwarf woman. "Brave daughter of Auli," he said gently, "your sacrifice has saved not just Middle-earth, but all the world. Will you accept the blessing of the Eldar before you pass?" Duath nodded weakly, and Gil-galad placed his hand upon her brow. Where he touched, her pain faded, and her face regained its strength and dignity. "You shall not pass alone into the darkness," the elf lord promised. "The light of Gilistel shall guide you to whatever realm awaits, and there you shall find rest and honor." With those words, Duath, daughter of Nyan, passed from Middle-earth, her face peaceful in the starlight. Around them, the last echoes of Ungwethren's presence faded like smoke before the wind. "It is done," said Gil-galad, and now his own form began to fade. "The shadow heart is bound beyond all hope of return, cast into the void from which not even the valor may rescue him. The threat to Middle-earth is ended." "But what of you?" asked Elrond, approaching his ancient king. "Will you not return to us? Middle-earth has great need of your wisdom." Gil-galad shook his noble head. "My time in the circles of the world is ended. I remained only to face this final evil, and now that duty is discharged. The West calls to me, and I must answer." He looked around at the company one last time. "Guard well what we have preserved. The Fourth Age begins now, and it belongs to men. Guide them wisely." With those words, the High King of the Noldor faded into light, and that light rose like a shooting star toward the western sky, where it vanished among the eternal stars. In the days that followed the destruction of Ungwethren, a great healing came upon the lands around Dol Guldur. The poisoned earth began to bloom with new growth, and the twisted creatures that had served the Shadow Heart fled back to whatever dark places had spawned them. The fortress itself crumbled to dust, as though its very stones had been held together by malice alone. In its place, a spring of pure water bubbled up from the ground, the first clean water to flow in that place for more than 1,000 years. "The land remembers what it was before the shadow fell upon it," said Gandalf, leaning heavily on his staff. The battle with Ungwethren had drained even his considerable strength. "Give it time, and this will be a fair place once more." Legolas knelt by the new spring, cupping the clear water in his hand. "The trees speak of it already. They say the very air tastes sweeter, and the songs of birds return to branches that have known only silence." King Thranduil stood where the highest tower of Dol Guldur had once loomed, his keen eyes scanning the transformed landscape. "My realm is free at last of the shadow that has haunted it since before my father's time. The woodland realm shall know peace, such as it has not known since the elder days." But even as they celebrated their victory, Círdan, the shipwright, gazed westward with troubled eyes. "I sense a great stirring across the sea," he said quietly to Elrond. "The Valar themselves take notice of what has transpired here. This was no ordinary evil we faced." "Indeed," replied Elrond, following his gaze toward the distant shores of Valinor. "Ungwethren's corruption ran deeper than we knew. His influence upon Sauron, upon all the evils that have plagued Middle-earth. We have been fighting shadow of shadows, never knowing the true source of the darkness." Gimli, who had been preparing a cairn of stones to mark Duath's passing, looked up from his work. The lass spoke true words before she left us. The old bindings still have power, but only if we remember them. How much else have we forgotten in our haste to embrace the new ages? That is wisdom, friend Gimli, said Gandalf. In our joy at Sauron's defeat, we nearly allowed a greater evil to escape our notice. We must not make such an error again. The wizard's words proved prophetic, for even as they spoke, ravens were flying from the lonely mountain bearing strange tidings. Dian Ironfoot had sent word that the deepest mines of Erebor had begun to echo with sounds that were not the work of dwarf picks, sounds that spoke of things stirring in the roots of the mountain. It seems our work is not yet finished, said Legolas grimly, reading the message that a swift sparrow had brought from his father's hall. If Ungvethrin's influence was as vast as Gil-galad suggested, there may be other servants, other corruptions that outlived their master. Thranduil nodded slowly. Then we must be vigilant. The Fourth Age may have begun, but it will not be the age of peace we had hoped for. Not yet. They buried Duath, where the spring bubbled up from the clean earth, marking her grave with the runes of her people and the star sign of Gil-galad. It was a fitting rest for one who had saved the world with words of power older than kingdom. As they prepared to depart for their various realms, each bearing word of the victory and warnings of what might yet come, Gandalf paused at the edge of the spring. In the clear water, he saw reflected not his own face, but glimpses of other lands, other shadows that stirred in places where the light of Gil-Estel did not reach. The game is far from over, he murmured to himself, but perhaps, with vigilance and wisdom, we may yet see true peace come to Middle-earth. 3 months had passed since the fall of Dol Guldur, and across Middle-earth, the free peoples worked to root out the last traces of Ungvethrin's corruption. In Minas Tirith, King Elisar had established a new order of scholars dedicated to preserving the ancient lore. In Erebor, the dwarves delved deeper than ever before, seeking to understand the whispers that echoed in their deepest halls. But it was in Rivendell, in the House of Elrond, that the greatest discovery was made. Elladan and Elrohir, the twin sons of Elrond, had been tasked with examining every scroll and tome in their father's vast library, searching for any mention of other servants or artifacts of the Shadowheart. It was Elrohir who found the hidden compartment behind the shelves that held the records of the Second Age. "Father!" he called, his voice tight with urgency. "You must see this." Elrond came swiftly, followed by the other members of the White Council who had remained in Rivendell to continue their research. What Elrohir had found was a single sheet of parchment, written in Gil-galad's own hand and sealed with the sigil of the High King. "To whosoever may read these words in the time of the Fourth Age," Elrond read aloud, his voice growing more troubled with each line. "If you have found this, then Ungvethrin has been defeated, and I have passed from the circles of the world. But know this, he was not the only one." A silence fell upon the chamber, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees of Rivendell. 3 there were who fell to shadow before the awakening of the elves. The letter continued. Ungwethrin the Corrupter, who sought dominion through transformation. Thuringwethil the Deceiver, who spread lies like poison through the hearts of the faithful. And greatest and most terrible of all, Gothmog the Destroyer, who delighted in the unmaking of all things fair. Gandalf's face had gone pale as winter snow. Gothmog, but that was the name of Morgoth's captain, the Lord of Balrogs. Surely Gil-galad did not mean the names were taken by lesser servants in mockery of their masters. Elrond read on, but the true Gothmog, the first and greatest of the fallen Maiar, was bound in chains of starlight beneath the roots of Thangorodrim. When that fortress fell, his prison was thought broken and himself destroyed. But the bindings held, and he sank deeper, beyond the reach of the Valar's sight. The implications struck them like hammer blows. If Ungwethrin had been terrible in his power, what might Gothmog accomplish if freed? The Destroyer had been Morgoth's greatest servant before even the Balrogs were conceived, a being of such malice that his very presence had withered the light of the two trees. I fear, Gil-galad's letter concluded, that should Ungwethrin fall, his defeat may serve to weaken the bonds that hold his brethren. Watch therefore for signs of the destroyer's stirring, for if he breaks free, all our victories will be as dust before the hurricane. Círdan, who had remained silent throughout the reading, now spoke with the weight of ages in his voice. The signs are already there, for those who know how to read them. The gray ships that come to my havens speak of storms in the distant west, storms that blow from no earthly wind, and in the depths of the sea, the servants of Ulmo whisper of something that moves in the abyssal trenches, something that should not be. Then we are faced with a choice, said Elrond gravely. Do we tell the people of Middle-earth that their greatest victory may have doomed them to an even greater peril? Or do we bear this knowledge alone and prepare in secret for what is to come? It was Gandalf who answered, his voice heavy with the wisdom of ages. We tell them the truth, but not all of it, and not all at once. Let them know that vigilance is still required, that the victory over darkness is never final. But let them also have hope, for hope is what will sustain them through the trials ahead. And so it was decided. Messengers rode out from Rivendell to all the free people, bearing word that new threats might yet arise, and that the old alliances must be maintained. But the full truth of Gothmog's existence was shared only among the wise, who began to prepare for a battle that might not come for years, or decades, or centuries. In the end, they had learned the hardest lesson of all, that victory against evil is never final, that each generation must face its own darkness, and that the price of peace is eternal vigilance. The Fourth Age had indeed begun, but it would be an age of watchfulness as much as wonder, of guardians as much as gardeners. Yet even as they prepared for future perils, they did not forget to celebrate the peace they had won. For in the end, it is not the shadows we face that define us, but the light we choose to kindle against them. And that light, once lit, can never truly be extinguished. Thus ends the tale of the whispers of Dol Guldur, but the watch continued, and will continue, as long as there are those brave enough to stand against the darkness and wise enough to remember that some shadows are deeper than others. Finis.